Hello and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast, and it comes after the news at the weekend that the former First Minister Alex Salmond died of a suspected massive heart attack at the age of 69 in North Macedonia. This has led to saturation coverage of analysis of his political career. And in this podcast, we are going to look at Alex Salmond, the man, Alex Salmond, the politician, and consider the legacy for his career in terms of what it means for politics today, and indeed what it may well mean going into the future. The first thing, of course, that we should say is that our thoughts are with his wife, Moira, whom I know and spoke to just a matter of 6 weeks ago, and the wider Salmond family, who will be in some acute distress today. But let's look on a very, very full political life. Alex, your own recollections and reflections?
Yeah, I mean, look, Alex Salmond was, without question, the most consequential Scottish politician of our time. I think you could make an argument, a reasonable argument, actually, that he was the most consequential Scottish politician of the last 50 years, possibly, or since the Second World War. And as a consequence of that significance, he was also unavoidably an immensely divisive figure. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Politics is about argument and division to a certain degree. My own relationships with Salmond were sort of somewhat, well, not necessarily complex, but I became very much aware that you were either in with Salmond or very much out with Salmond. There was a time when, actually, just after he became First Minister, his people, one of his special advisors, got in touch with me and asked if I might be interested in working for him as a speechwriter. And in the event, nothing came of this, but it remains the case that the SNP and Alex Salmond are the only political party that has ever even floated the possibility I might go and work for them. And at that point, I suppose he sort of liked me rather more than he did in later years. I know for a fact that he at one point referred to me as a reprobate, which I'm perfectly comfortable with that judgment coming from him. But, I mean, Salmond, a titanic figure. He had to dominate every room that he was in. And that was something that was very much apparent, I think, with anybody who had any dealings with him. I mean, he was a person capable of immense generosity to people and inspiring considerable, remarkable loyalty, in fact, from many people. But the flip side of that was that he could be, as an individual, as an employer, if you like, extremely demanding, to the point of bullying a lot of the time, I think, and be quite unreasonable in his dealings with a lot of people, particularly people significantly junior to him. So, complicated individual as a personality, an extrovert in many respects, someone who had to have company at all times. I think the idea of Alex Salmond dining alone and curling up with a book at night at Bute House and so on, just not something that ever featured in his life, something he was sort of constitutionally incapable of, I think. But, Bernard, you were, covering him for 35 years or so for STV, had many more personal interactions with him than I did. I was tend to be viewing it from afar. So take us through, if you like, the sort of ups and downs of your professional and personal relationships with Alex Salmond.
I'm still coming to terms with the fact that you were on the radar as a potential speechwriter and potential SPAD for Mr. Salmond, because I was never on any such radar. I mean, my relationship with him, which does go back about 35 years, was incredibly uncomplicated. He was very, very direct with me, and I was always very, very direct with him. I know that not every journalist, and indeed not every broadcaster, shared the same kind of relationship with you. Alec was the kind of man that if he sniffed fear in a journalist, could exploit it for the purposes of his own propaganda. But let me tell you, every senior politician is exactly the same. That's why they're senior politicians. I would say that, in terms of the public view of him, the public view of Alex Salmond is completely and utterly dominated by his television persona. So they see him in Parliament, they see him making speeches, they see him taking parts in debates in television, where of course he's very direct, overly direct, pugilistic. And people form an impression of a person based upon a television personality. Now, there is a world of difference between the television personality, upon which public judgments are made, and the private individual. In private, when he was relaxed, he was completely and utterly different. And I'm sure that those who worked with him as spads would tell you this. He could be extremely convivial over dinner. I had dinner with him in Glasgow 7 weeks ago on a Friday night. He loved to reminisce. He was almost whimsical in recollecting stories from the past, events of the past. He absolutely loved gossip. He didn't like gossip in the sense that he would tell a story to do someone down or to humiliate people. He liked the gossip because it put some context to a point that he was making. He was also much, much, much more relaxed in private than the on-performance mode that you got in public. And if he was dining with you with his wife, Moira, he was even more relaxed. One of the things that perhaps is not talked about, Alex Salmond, is that he was actually a student of political history. And I don't just mean the history of the national movement in Scotland. He was completely and utterly fascinated by the history of other political parties. He was fascinated by the personalities in other parties. I think he saw George Osborne pretty regularly. Journalists that weren't sympathetic, like Andrew Neil, he saw reasonably regularly. David Davis, of course, he saw regularly. He was interested in politics in the general sense. In terms of discussions about politics, I can't recall having a long discussion with Alex Salmond ever about senior nationalists, but I can recall having lots of conversations with Alex Salmond about Harold Wilson, whom we both admired greatly. And that, in a sense, shows the terrain of the man. There was also, and I'll finish on this point, he was one of these politicians who was capable of great kindnesses behind the scene, which would actually surprise many people who simply see this sort of titan of the nationalist movement, pugilist, and they simply don't equate the public persona with the way in which he could be in private. A friend of mine who had a very, very serious health scare during the time when Alex Salmond was First Minister, this individual himself is a public figure and a well-known individual within the country. And this was a very, very major health scare. I got a handwritten personal note from Alex Salmond wishing him all the best. The words were very, very carefully chosen. This was all the more surprising because this particular individual had a track record, if I can put it this way, of not supporting the SNP. So there's these little things which, in a sense, almost stand at odds with the perception that a lot of the public have. But as you have quite rightly pointed out, he was a complex man. But then again, most politicians who have operated at a very senior level can be complex politically and complex emotionally.
Yes, one of the things about Alex Salmond, I think, that always struck me was that, and this was certainly the case in my personal encounters with him, was that unlike some politicians, unlike his successor, actually, as leader of the SNP and First Minister of Scotland, Salmond loved arguing with people who didn't actually agree with him on everything. In actual fact, in many respects, he was more comfortable having that kind of engagement with people than surrounding himself all the time with people who just sort of did agree with him. The cut and thrust of argument was central to his life, I think. he also, he would very much, I think, have, he'd cite Teddy Roosevelt's lines about, it's the man in the arena who counts. And if you're not in the arena, however astute and however knowledgeable you are, your recall of political history and events and so on, you still are not really well placed to understand what it's like to be in the arena. He loved the big stage. And I think one of the things that we see from that actually is that one of the ironies about Alex Salmond is that although he was the leader of the independence movement and devoted his entire working life, or effectively to the pursuit of independence, he was in many ways much more comfortable on a British stage than a Scottish one. I mean, the House of Commons, with its history, of which he knew a lot, and its size, and the sense that great decisions have been taken here that have had an impact on far-flung parts of the world, appealed to Salmond in the same way as yes, dinners with Andrew Neil or Jeremy Paxman or whoever appealed to Alex Salmond, because this was a bigger stage than anything that Scotland could provide him. And there is an irony, something of a paradox there, that he had to, he loved performing. And one of the things, though, that I think that we've got from some of the initial coverage is a sense that a lot of the SNP's rise from a position of some marginality to being the dominant political force in the land was somehow inevitable, and that it was always going to happen. And I think that is probably not actually true. The reasons for the SNP's rise are complicated and many, but it is also fair to say that it is very difficult to imagine how it could have happened without Alex Salmond. But to examine some of this, in some ways we need to go really quite a long way back. I think if you look at the contradictions within Salmond, here's one that I'll throw out to you just now, Bernard. Alex Salmond is a member of the 79 group of left-wing activists within the Scottish National Party. Now, most of them are not elected representatives at the time. There is a big dispute within the SNP about the party's future direction. The 79 group are expelled for a short period of time. But Alex Salmond was never a socialist. Alex Salmond could very easily, if he had been brought up in another part of the world, another part of the United Kingdom, not have been on the left at all. But one of his great gifts was, I think, to be all things to all people and to allow people to see in him a vehicle for their own aspirations, whether they happen to be on the slightly to the right of centre or slightly to the left of centre.
I agree with some of it, but not all of it. Let me put it this way. I think his great skill as a politician was to have a political nose for where the country was at any one particular period of time, where, if you like, the mainstream point of view lay. And in that, I think he had something in common with somebody who was radically different from him, in fact, very different from him, almost in all respects, and that was Willie Ross, who was the Labour Secretary of State in the 1960s and from 74 to 76. I mean, Harold Wilson trusted Willie Ross's judgment. He saw Willie Ross and Scottish Labour as one and the same thing, and he really deferred on all matters Scotland to Willie Ross because he thought that Ross knew where the beating political pulse of the nation lay. And I think that there was a shade of that with Alex Salmond as well. You are right to go all the way back to the 79 group, which included people like Kenny MacAskill, like Andrew Curry, like Stuart Stevenson. Ian Blackford, I think, was also in the 79 group.
Yeah, not
Jim Sillars.
Yeah. Ian Blackford, Ian Blackford, not a socialist.
Margot MacDonald, Andrew Curry, and they had that famous walkout at the Dam Park Pavilion in Ayr in 1982 after Gordon Wilson had made his famous speech about banning internal groups. But what were the three founding principles of the 79 group? Socialism, nationalism, and republicanism. Now, Alec latterly had, I think, more or less rested on a Republican point of view after the death of the late Queen. But back then, he wasn't any Republican at all. that was for a subject which he really wanted to avoid discussing because he thought it would take the national movement up a cul-de-sac. So there was no republicanism. There was no socialism in the sense, and we have to define what we mean by this. He wasn't a clause 4 socialist. He did not believe in the means of production, distribution, and exchange coming into public ownership. In that sense, if you were placing Alex Salmond on the Labour spectrum, he wasn't in that sense on the Labour left. He wasn't an Tony Benn. He wasn't a Jeremy Corbyn. He probably would have been on maximum the soft left of the Labour Party. And on the national question, even at that time, he believed in a big tent approach in terms of bringing people of all parties and no parties behind a strategy. When I produced a documentary on his 10 years as leader, after he resigned first time around, Professor James Mitchell, Professor of Government at the University of Edinburgh, when referring to his politics at this time, made the point that he wasn't a Republican, he wasn't a socialist in classic Marxist terms, and that on the national question, he was a gradualist. So Professor Mitchell scored Alex Salmond as a half out of 3 in terms of his commitment to 79 group things. But the importance of that, and let me get your view on this, the real importance of the 79 group, and this is, I think, you're absolutely right, Alec, in making the point that the reasons in terms of the journey that the SNP made all the way to government, they're many, they're varied, they're complex. Although the 79 group was just a left-wing group that eventually disbanded, the real historical legacy of the 79 group, and this is where Salmond's contribution is important, is that it faced, or it forced the SNP into accepting that they had to own up to some sort of political ideology, that in a sense they had to choose a philosophy. And the legacy, therefore, was that it did eventually move them left. And arguably, if you didn't have the 79 group, or if you didn't have these debates, it might not have been the case that the SNP would have been in a position, for example, to really inflict a lot of damage on the Labour Party in 2007.
Absolutely. And that, again, had been a long-term process. I mean, if you think, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the road to devolution as well. You have it is now quite common to hear people, including elected MSPs, sort of saying that, well, of course, devolution was in some sense an SNP project. Well, it was not. The SNP boycotted the Constitutional Convention that played a large part in sort of setting the parameters within which devolution would take place. The battle between the fundamentalists who feared that devolution was a trap and the gradualists led by Salmond who saw it correctly, as it turns out, as an opportunity, was one that was clearly won by Salmond. But it was a bitter dispute within the nationalist movement. It wasn't all plain sailing for Salmond. And devolution was, the Scottish Labour Party, having been divided on devolution in the 1970s, through the 1980s and into the 1990s, it becomes all but unanimously, I say all but unanimously because we have to remember Tam Dalyell, of course, but, convinced of the virtues of devolution, both for its own sake, believing genuinely that it would lead to the better government of Scotland, but also as a defensive mechanism to ensure that you would never again have a Conservative government elected to London that had minority support in Scotland, being able to, if you like, impose or implement unpopular policies in Scotland or policies that had been rejected in some sense by the Scottish electorate. So devolution was to be a bulwark against Thatcherism, not a bulwark against nationalism to anything like the same degree. Now, that reflected, I suppose, Scottish Labour's confidence that it would always be in the driving seat in Scottish politics, and that it didn't have to worry too much about the SNP. What Salmond, I think, understood, and here he has been vindicated by subsequent events, was that if the Conservatives are effectively persona non grata in Scottish politics, and there is no prospect of the Scottish people voting for Tory candidates in sufficient numbers to make a Tory government in a devolved parliament possible, then at some point there has to be opposition, an alternative to the Labour-Liberal devolutionary consensus. And if the Tories aren't in that game, aren't in that race, then it can only be the SNP that can capitalise on that need for an opposition, can fill that hole, that vacuum. And that is what we begin to see happening, and happens when Salmond returns for his second spell as leader. And there are other things that contribute to it. I think the growing unpopularity of the Iraq War, doubts about Tony Blair more generally, all of these feed in to the SNP's chances of usurping the Labour Party. But it's all, it's a series of accidents almost that end up with the SNP in power, right down to the fact that, Salmond asserts victory in 2007, having won 47 seats to Labour's 46. But you have the famous thing of, the votes from Arran that are coming over on the ferry, and water has got into them, and 1,000 votes are lost, and who knows what, that might have possibly made the difference in a very close constituency there. And it's, not impossible that Labour could have won 47 seats and the SNP 46, and the whole temper of Scottish political history then shifts. These flukes and accidents are an important part of any political journey. It's not preordained, and some of the coverage in the last couple of days, I think, has perhaps erred a little bit too much on the side of, well, of course this was always going to happen. It isn't, but Salmond did have the if you like, the tactical nous and strategic acumen to take advantage of the opportunities that he was given. And as a result of his success in doing that, we forget some of his previous mistakes. The penny for Scotland promise in 1999, which proved disastrous for the SNP in that election. His own struggle to adapt to leading the party in a devolved government, which he didn't particularly enjoy. Good fortune and contingency are underappreciated forces in politics, I would suggest.
Let me go back to your point about his strategic acumen, because I think it's a correct one, and maybe illustrate this with a couple of issues. I think I first met him, actually, when the way my memory now gets jogged. Many, many moons ago, I was on the executive of the Campaign for a Scottish Assembly, as it was then called. I was also a member of the STUC's Anti-Poll Tax Committee, and the three SNP representatives on that were Kenny McCaskill, Gil Patterson, and Alex Salmond. Now, Alex Salmond at this point, of course, wasn't leader. This was before Gordon Wilson resigned in 1990. And the issue of non-payment of the poll tax, in a sense, was classic Salmond in terms of strategic acumen. He was not by instinct a lawbreaker. He was not by instinct a man who was going to erect the barricades in the streets and have all sorts of civil disobedience in order to defeat the poll tax. The non-payment of the poll tax, which was a big issue for the SNP in the late 1980s, it was perhaps the issue more than anything else that got Jim Sillars over the line in the famous Gough by-election in November of 1988. But that was chosen for strategic reasons, because in 87, Scotland had voted for 50 Labour MPs, the feeble 50. The nationalists used to call them the feeble 50, who were not standing up for Scotland. And the SNP were being seen to stand up for Scotland by saying, as Jim Sillars used to say, "We're no pine Thatcher's poll tax," and all of that kind of stuff. Alec embraced that, not out of any radical left-wing reasons. He didn't embrace it because of, I want to sort of break the law in order to make a point. He did it tactically to outflank Labour. And on the point on the Constitutional Convention, I think you're right that he was, or his view of this was vindicated. At that particular point, he wasn't the leader, but he was completely, Alec's view on this, which I can tell you because we discussed it on many occasions, was that the SNP should go into the Constitutional Convention, and there would come a point where the convention would agree a scheme. But he believed that the SNP's position should be that that scheme should be put in a multi-option referendum. And at the point when the Unionist Party saying we're not playing ball with a multi-option referendum, the SNP should withdraw from the convention on a point of principle. And he very much wanted the SNP to go in, but he was completely outmaneuvered by Gordon Wilson and by Jim Sillars. And in fact, the SNP, and this is forgotten, actually turned up to the interim business committee meeting of the convention, the very, very first interim business committee meeting held at COSLA in January of 89. They eventually decided at the National Council in Port Glasgow in March of 89 not to go into the convention. But Salmond could see a strategic reason for going in, because the one thing that he did have was that he looked quite rightly at politics as, where is your end game? And if you're going to get to the end game, what moves in the chessboard of political strategy do you need to make to get yourself there? Others have always, I think, acted out of instinct, an impetuous side, but you're right to say he always looked ahead, and he was genuinely an impressive strategic thinker. Also, I think, right to say that this sometimes came with elements of political gamble, attendant political risk, and it most certainly did not pay off in all circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one other thing I think that it's worth dwelling on, because we see a shift from the 1990s compared to, say, the 2005, 2006, 2007, and the years afterwards and so on, is a change in the SNP's tone and the way it talks. I remember there's a truly awful party political broadcast from the 1990s of Alex Salmond and Jim Sillars wearing sort of Jackanory style woolen sweaters with some kids, and they're talking about, what sort of country are you? What sort of person are you? Are you the kind of feeble, weak people who allow your neighbours to trample all over you? In this instance, by allowing nuclear waste to be reprocessed at Dounreay and so on. Well, if you're a Scot, then you are exactly this kind of wimp, this feeble person. And it's time for us to stand up for ourselves. And I don't think this was a particularly persuasive avenue for the SNP to go down, but it made the SNP, I think, often look sort of small, somewhat pathetic, very much nationalist in terms of directly blaming the English for our problems. And that Scotland is actually just sort of too feeble, too weak, too stupid to appreciate the opportunities it actually has. So the SNP spent quite a lot of time in that period effectively or implicitly scolding Scottish voters for not being brave enough to embrace their national destiny and independence. Fast forward a number of years, and you get a very different tone from the SNP and a much more effective one, which is all about opportunity, that yes, we can. Barack Obama's phrase, effectively is used by the SNP well in advance of Obama himself, that it's all about opportunity and delivery, that there is no reason why we can't do better things for ourselves, that Scotland just needs to take control of its own destiny, that it is not a question of Scotland being victimised or being an oppressed colony. That no, far from that. And so you get this big shift in tone from the SNP, and they begin to tell a much happier, cheerful, positive, optimistic kind of nationalism that proves much more effective because it's a much more attractive and approachable and accessible kind of thing. And I think that's one of the big shifts in the SNP story that plays a big part in its subsequent success.
I think this line, which and Alec used to describe them as a social democratic party in the mainstream of European social democracy, I mean, how did they get there? So we talked a little bit earlier on about the 79 group, which wasn't around for a long period of time and was disbanded. I mean, after he became leader in 1990, and we have to remember that the party establishment backed Margaret Ewing to succeed Gordon Wilson, including Jim Sillars, who at that point was the party's deputy leader, despite the fact that Sillars and Salmond had been in the 79 group. Jim Sillars backed Margaret Ewing. Jim always says that he managed to sniff something of the personality cult that was around Alec at that particular time, and therefore he backed Margaret Ewing because he thought Margaret Ewing would have been more collegiate in terms of the leadership. But let's just talk a little bit about the early years of his leadership, because they were quite interesting. In a sense, he didn't force an argument on the Constitutional Convention because he rightly judged that he couldn't win that. The party was effectively, he would say, bounced by Gordon Wilson and Jim Sillars. But very early on in his leadership, and I talked to him about this because I thought it was very instructive, that they went into the 1992 general election on the slogan, "Free by 93." Now, let me tell you, Salmond thought that was nuts. Utter nuts. And yet, the fact is that he was the leader. Yeah. He was the leader who was prosecuting a slogan which wasn't his. It was a slogan which was used, I think, at a fringe event at the conference by Alec Neil. We're going to drive Scotland forward, the 1992 general election, and we're going to be free by 93. So here is the leader early on who is a prisoner of a strategy which is not of his own making. And I used to say to him, why didn't you just bin it? Take it on. Tell them that it was nuts. Tell them that it's not up to political activists to decide in a timetable for Scottish independence. That quite rightly is a matter for the voters. And his view was that had he binned it, he would have split the party, and that what he didn't want was a split in the party in the run-up to the 1992 general election. So he effectively went into that election with a slogan which he didn't believe in. So there was a certain sense in which I think it's fair to say that in that circumstance he lacked a little bit of political courage. It could also be said that he lacked a little bit of political courage in terms of the genesis of the SNP's conversion to social democracy, because he put a motion up to the party's annual conference. It was moved, I think, by Andrew Doig from Falkirk and seconded by Andrew Wilson. And it was clear in the aftermath of 92 that the mainstream feeling in the hall was that they weren't quite comfortable with this notion of labelling the SNP as a social democratic party. So the motion was remitted back. Now, a big political leader would have stood up at the conference and said, I want you to embrace this. It's important in terms of our philosophical journey. If we're going to get our end game, we have to embrace this. But he didn't. He let it quietly be remitted back, and then allowed the SNP the space to eventually park itself on the ideological point that he wanted them to go. So although he was completely and utterly consistent about making sure that this journey was going to take place, to ensure that at some point they could take over large sections of the Labour vote in the Central Belt, he could have done it in a much more direct way. He could have done it in a much more courageous way. But in the early years of his leadership, I think people forget he was incredibly cautious.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a thing, I mean, I think that's all very true. And there's an element there of, well, my opponents have this free by 93 slogan. I don't think it's going to work, but let's let them have enough rope to, if you like, hang themselves. And, you know, after which point they will have to have no option really but to come round to the course I want to set for the party. But, you know, party management and managing the party, you know that is a theme that runs throughout his career and so on. If you fast forward a few years to, you know, the SNP's conversion to NATO membership, for instance, you know, that is something where, you know, the groundwork for that was prepared over quite a number of years. Angus Robertson was very central to that, and certain difficult questions that are that come with NATO membership are just sort of parked on the sidelines and say, well, we will agree not to open that box. And in this instance, the question, well, would American nuclear submarines, for instance, pass through Scottish waters? And, you know, to what extent are you really an anti-nuclear party if you are members of a nuclear alliance. Again, put that in a box, we'll park that. But the strategic importance of bringing the SNP into a pro-NATO position is that it cuts off a line of attack from our opponents in a referendum campaign, in the same way as the party's conversion to monarchism, at least in theory, or as a matter of policy, is also designed to make independence seem less threatening, less of a change, less difficult, less risky, and to ward off lines of attack. And these are, I would say, were perfectly sensible moves for Salmond to make. But we've got through quite a bit of time here and so on, and they're still not really in government.
I think we could probably say, Alex, that the timeline is that they embrace social democracy, and when the country are sort of falling out of love with Labour voters look at the SNP at that kind of point as a party that it is more than acceptable to vote for. They're quite happy to vote for, because quite a lot of people, I think, saw them as, if I can put it crudely like this, and it is very crude, the SNP looked, some people would dispute this, lots of people would dispute it, but to some voters, the SNP just looked like old Labour with independence thrown in. And for a lot of Labour voters, that was something which they were very comfortable with. But it then gets on to the question, and so let me pose it to you, what kind of administration were they? How did he perform as First Minister? I'll just offer you a very, very quick view on this. Not so much, maybe you can deal with the policy terms. We did a STV, I think Mike Crowe did a half hour on Alex Salmond's first 100 days as First Minister. And I remember having a number of conversations with him around this time. And he was, I have to tell you, very, very, very affected to becoming First Minister. There was an element, and this wasn't always the case with Alex Salmond. I remember him saying to me, the responsibility of the office is huge. And when he said that he genuinely felt honoured, it wasn't a sort of stock and trade line that politicians give when they get to high office. I think he genuinely felt that this was the pinnacle of a political journey, and he was acutely conscious that this was historical in terms of the SNP. And I remember him in almost whispered tones in his office at the Parliament saying, I think I need to change my style because I'm First Minister for the whole of Scotland. And for large sections of the first 100 days, his tone was very, very ameliorative towards opponents. His conversation with the country was couched in very ameliorative tones. But of course, shortly thereafter, Alec went back to being Alec, because the one thing in politics that you can't do is to play against type. You can't play against the essence of your personality. And the essence of Alec's personality was to see, in a sense, debate as a conflict of ideas. And if you see it as a conflict of ideas, then your presentational style, falls into line with that. And he went back to being Alec the Bruiser. Alec, I will slug out the arguments with my opponents. But he was very affected in the early days. And the one thing that I think he did do was that certainly very early on, I thought the office of First Minister almost seems to have been elevated just a little, because I think he did bring an element of gravitas to it that had been lacking up to that point.
In 2007, you have a number of things happening at once and so on. On the one hand, there's this great surprise to some extent that the SNP are in a position to form a minority administration. That is, their ability to do so is effectively dependent on the Conservatives. And Salmond reaches out to Annabel Goldie and says, look, we can quietly work together. We have a number of things that we are interested in. We both wish to see an alternative to the Labour Liberal coalition that has been in office for the last 8 years. So there's that, which is both pragmatic and politically sensible, in terms of, the first rule of politics, as Lyndon Johnson always used to say, is, learn how to count. And when you've only got 47 MSPs out of 129, you need to be able to count. You need to be able to get support from elsewhere. But there is an immediate shift of tone as well. On the one hand, you have the SNP thinking, well, this could be our only chance, so let's not make a hash of it. But you also get a sense that the country is ready for a larger, more active, more ambitious government that carries itself with a bit more swagger. And in that sense, Alex Salmond is the perfect vehicle for this rising tide of aspiration in some respects. And so the symbolic step of rebranding the Scottish executive as the Scottish government, which again was something that was done very, very quickly, is a small thing in one sense, because in the day-to-day delivery of services, for instance, it makes no great difference. But as a public piece of public relations and as a piece of signposting to an imagined different and larger future, it's a very, very telling moment, because it signals a change in the way in which devolution is going to be made to work, and the ends to which devolution might be able to work. But even then, it's reasonable, I think, to point out that in 2007, 2008, not even Alex Salmond and the SNP are thinking that in just 4 years' time, they might win a majority at Holyrood, and have the opportunity to put the national question right at the centre of Scottish public life. Not even they are thinking that at that point. That only comes later.
Yeah, I mean, I said earlier on that I think that one of his skills was to know where the pulse of the nation was at any one particular time. And in terms of things like free tuition, the rocks will melt in the sun before he would back tuition fees. There were a number of policies around which he branded the administration. Now, from a left-wing perspective, I think that a number of these policies could be legitimately attacked. The sort of universal nature of freebies for the middle classes and so on. And I think that these policies, which were popular, they were popular with the voters, so there's no doubt that that was the case. It'll be interesting in the next couple of years to see whether or not these policies are now financially sustainable. Time will tell on that. But certainly in the first administration, and we could do a separate podcast on where these policies, where they write from a centre-left perspective in politics. I would argue that some of them wouldn't, but that's a slightly separate argument. For the purposes of looking at Alex Salmond's legacy, they were popular. He branded his administration around them. And the Labour Party, I think, made the mistake of reading the 2010 Westminster election as meaning that the SNP's time was up in 2011. And they bust the electoral system in 2011, and it was at that point where the SNP changed from being regarded as a competent administration articulating the views of mainstream Scotland to a party which was on the cusp of attempting a constitutional revolution after 2011.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's an appropriate moment, Bernard, at which to bring part one of what is now a two-part series on the life and times of Alex Salmond to an end. We will be back with the second half of the podcast on Wednesday. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.